First of all, I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank the Westmoreland County Museum for hosting. I want to thank the A.T. Johnson Museum for hosting. This is a story that I think has affected a few people in the room. I've learned that already tonight. We have some relatives of people who went and worked on the C.C.C. Corps in the area and also at the state park. So this is a local story. It's an individual story. It's also a big story, too. Deals with a country grappling for survival, a condition that in a lot of ways is very foreign to anything I think has been experiencing this country in a very long time. And that's something I always try to emphasize when I talk about the Great Depression and Civilian Conservation Corps, exactly how bad conditions were at the time. So I'll go through and I will talk about the conditions in the Great Depression, the New Deal, the necessity of it, and the creation of the Civilian Conservation Corps. I'll talk about the individual program here at the state park and the beginnings of Virginia state parks. And then I'll talk about the actual details of how the park was built, the lives of the men who were involved, those who were from the area, those who came and stayed, and those who came and left. And we have really just about all three categories were present there. So if you can imagine, in early 1933, there's a new administration in Washington. It's the Roosevelt administration, had just been elected in November of the previous year, November of 1932, but things don't really appear to be changing. 1933 was the worst year of the Great Depression. A lot of people don't know that. They anticipated it would be the first few years after the Black Friday stock market crash in 1929. That's not really the case. It kind of snowballed, and it reached its peak 32, and particularly in 33. So Roosevelt was elected on an ambitious new platform of government involvement in the economy, right, to go and kind of turn around directly as a repudiation of Hoover's program beforehand. But on the ground level, things didn't appear to change, at least for the first few months. Now it took, again, things were bad out there, right? So it took a little bit for the program that Roosevelt hoped to implement to catch on, but when it did, it kind of spread throughout the country. And the programs that Roosevelt asked for were unheard of on a national scale. They were something that Roosevelt had tried in previous positions that he held. He was governor of New York when he ran for office under the Democratic ticket, and he, of course, was governor during the early years of the Great Depression. So he had tried various programs in the state of New York to go and to alleviate the problems that they faced there. One of them was a civilian works relief program, and as soon as Roosevelt got into office, in March of 1933, Inauguration Day was later in the year than it is now, he immediately started to at least put together a semblance of a program, a civilian works sort of compilation on a national scale. This was not something he talked about during the campaign, but keep in mind presidential campaigns were very, very different at the time. A presidential candidate, would talk about what he was going to do and the problems he was going to fix if elected, but he really didn't go into the minutia of this and that issue and how I'm going to fix it. I'm going to implement this, specific program, things like that. So when he got into office in March of 1933, he started on, again, this works program, which was a new thing. It wasn't really expected. It was a small program when he was governor of New York, but he came out swinging with it, and he immediately asked Congress for a bill. This was just about the first 2 weeks he was in office. So March 21st, 1933, he came to Congress. He asked them for a program to fund all sorts of public works to go and put civilians, particularly the unemployed, to work on the street. And one of them was a program they called the Civilian Conservation Corps. Its main goal, at least proposed, was to go and to reseed trees, right? To go and to plant trees, particularly in sites that had been timbered throughout the country, particularly in the West, as well, and then also to plant trees in places that were in risk of erosion, particularly due to rainfall and flooding, things like that. That's how the Civilian Conservation Corps earned their early moniker of Roosevelt's Tree Army, right? Roosevelt went and he talked, when he asked Congress for this specific facet of his program, he talked about how it was a moral necessity, really, that it was the conservation part of it was important, but really, we need to keep young men off the street. They are literally starving. I don't use that term with hyperbole, They're literally starving. They were in danger of, as he called it, idleness, which might lead to crime. There was a potentiality of that. And then if we could take that energy and go and give these young men a paycheck and then also be able to funnel it into a program that would benefit the country at large, more so the better, right? So he went and he asked Congress for approval for this bill, and they passed it. They immediately got to work on formulating the Civilian Conservation Corps. It's impossible to talk about the structure of the Corps, really the structure of the New Deal, but particularly the structure of the Conservation Corps, without going into the type of man Franklin Roosevelt was. He's a very, very interesting figure in American history. He was the first of what presidential historians term the imperial presidencies, which means exactly like you would think, that the president functioned as an emperor. He had immense power over government agencies, over bureaucrats. That had never been done before Roosevelt, but he was a man of immense force of will, really. And that was certainly something that the country needed at the time, to go and pull on all these strings, pull together and get everyone facing forward and solving the problems at hand. And that characteristic of Roosevelt manifested itself very clearly, again, in all of the New Deal, but particularly in the Conservation Corps. Keep in mind, the Roosevelt administration was new. They had Republican presidents had occupied the previous three administrations. It was Hoover and then Coolidge and Harding before that. So the Democrats had not been in office for a good long while. So they didn't have structures of power in place that they could go and they could take and they could exploit. To put it shortly, they didn't just have their own people in power. They were coming in and they were entirely new. So they were trying to throw their weight around as much as possible and get this program accomplished. And sometimes there were a little bit of growing pains, if you will. So Roosevelt personally designed the structure of the Civilian Conservation Corps. He designed it as a 4-part power-sharing agreement between the Departments of Labor, Departments of Agriculture, Department of the Interior, and the Department of the Army, or really the War Department. The idea being, generally speaking, that the Department of the Interior and Department of Agriculture would go and they would find sites throughout the country where at this point again, theoretical Civilian Conservation Corps would work, and the Department of Labor would go and procure the men, and more on that in a second, who actually was involved in the Corps among the population, how they were selected. And then the the Department of the Army would go and handle the logistics, making sure everyone got where they needed to go, making sure they had the materials necessary to do the work they were required to do. In a lot of ways, Department of the Interior and Department of the Army were supposed to share the basic drawing up of the schemes, essentially, for how these public works projects were to be accomplished. Now, that 4-part power sharing agreement pretty much immediately became very confusing for the bureaucrats on the administrative level. No one could really figure out who was in charge. There was a director, Robert Fechner. He was a union man from Chattanooga. He'd been involved primarily in unionizing in automobiles in Detroit. And he was a friend of Roosevelt. Roosevelt brought him in. I'll talk more about him later. He's the second most important person after Roosevelt, in my opinion, in the formation of the Civilian Conservation Corps. But aside from Fechner on down, I wasn't really sure exactly who was in charge. Roosevelt had very, very ambitious goals. He wanted, again, this was March of 1933. By July 4th of 1933, same year, he wanted there to be 1,300 camps open. Okay. Or not camps, projects rather, that were being done by, again, the still theoretical members of the Civilian Conservation Corps. But he also wanted there to be 250,000 men. That's a lot. Now, don't get me wrong. This was ambitious. It was, in a way, necessary. The unemployment was enormous in the country. It was just about 20% at this point in history, a little bit over that percentage of the labor force, so just about 22, 23% of the labor force was unemployed. About 65% of the population was in poverty. That's not according to inflation or metrics, that's according to the metrics of the time, the economic situation of the time. So it's a very, very ambitious goal, very difficult for this sort of organization that is pulling itself at all different ends, that doesn't know exactly who's in charge to accomplish that. So an event happened that's very important to the structure and the later characters of the Civilian Conservation Corps, and that is that Roosevelt went directly to the Army. He asked them to take pretty much, not total control, but much larger control, a much larger share of the control than they had previously. And it's very interesting to read the documents, particularly the internal Army histories of this thing, because the Army absolutely wanted no part of this thing. They didn't even want to be on the original Corps, again, board, if you will. And the Army felt that way for a number of reasons, and they're a little bit strange hearing them with modern ears, but it made more sense at the time. The Army was concerned, first off, they didn't want to be involved in partisan politics. Now, people can kind of lose sight of this looking back as we do with 2020 hindsight, but the New Deal programs, particularly when Roosevelt got inaugurated, were very, very controversial, not only from the Republican side. The Republicans were concerned about the fiscal element here. They didn't want to be spending so much money as the programs required, but also from the Democrat side. There was enormous difference of opinion within Roosevelt's own party, particularly from the South, particularly with the governor of Louisiana, Huey Long, who's a fascinating character in and of himself. But the point being is that the New Deal was intensely partisan from day one. It got to be less so later on, but they also did not want to be essentially in, this is my words, not theirs, but they didn't want to be, in their view, babysitting civilians, Now, again, that sounds strange and even harsh to our ears, but you have to keep in mind, a program like this had never been tried before, where U.S. Army officers had jurisdiction over civilians organized in Army fashion for long periods of time. This had literally never happened before. Certainly not in a time of peace, let alone a time of war even. But the Army eventually acquiesced. When they made some concessions, the Army said basically, look, we have to have the structure of the Corps, as it is yet being designed, be very heavily military, and that was given to them. They went and they added a few consolations from the concessions that the Roosevelt administration wanted. Fechner, again, the director of the Corps, was extremely uncomfortable with this situation. He did not like this at all. The one thing he did ask was that there would be no military police, and that was granted, and that was, I think, very necessary, because that's something the Army definitely would have incorporated. But moving forward, this is about late April, early May of 1933. They're still trying to meet that goal by June 1st, so they allow the Army to come in, and enrollment immediately goes up. The numbers are kind of difficult to tell exactly, but it does definitely go up. It's likely that the Roosevelt administration met, or at least came very close to meeting their 250,000 goal by July 1st with the help of the Army. They were a little bit behind on the camps. It's a little bit over 1,000 by that point. But with the Army getting involved, that increased, in particular, not only the efficiency and the organization of the Civilian Conservation Corps, but also the public faith in this program in the Roosevelt administration. And at that point, young men really started enlisting in massive amounts in the Civilian Conservation Corps, and I'll talk a little bit about the requirements and who exactly was enlisting. The Corps was open to young men between the ages of 18 and 25. You did not have to have a certain level of education. You did not have to be particularly skilled. It was great if you were. You might even get a higher up position within your Corps structure, but it was certainly okay if you were not. The big thing about the core is that you had to be unemployed. You could not be in poverty. You had to be totally unemployed. And consequently, that went and attracted a lot of young single men. It wasn't really a requirement from day one that you had to be unmarried, but as time went on, it kind of became unspoken. Later on in history of the Corps, that requirement was removed due to different circumstances I'll get into. But the idea being that these were young men who were totally without hope. They were totally without means, save what they could make on their own on the streets. A lot of them were from urban communities, not all of them by any standards. About 55–60% were from urban communities. The rest were from rural communities, and that's a difference there. Some of them were from 10–15% maybe were from actually farm settings, farm rural settings, and some of them were from, the majority of the rural fellows were from small towns, basically. The Corps was segregated. That was a condition that they had to do. They would not have been able to move into the South, have this core programs, or really, in a lot of ways, any New Deal programs if they did not segregate. That was a condition the southern states asked for. So they had the Corps throughout the entire country was structured into white, into black. In the West, they had a few Hispanic Corps, and then in Oklahoma, a few Native American Corps. The Corps that we had here in Westmoreland County, we have three main ones. There was Company 287. They were here about it is a little bit difficult 90 years on to tell exactly when these groups came and left. But they were here about mid-1933, right after the Army took over, to about 35. Then they were replaced by Company 2352, which was here from about 36 until 40, and both of those were at the site that's now Westmoreland State Park. Then there was a third company, which is a little bit further back in the historiography, but that was Company 351, and they were headquartered at George Washington's birthplace. But they did some work, certainly a lot of work in Westmoreland County with some of the state park as well. These young men would enlist for 6-month tours, if you will. They didn't call them like that, but they were structured, again, like a Army enlistment. Instead of being 2 years, it was 6 months though. They could re-enlist afterward if they got good endorsements. Certainly, a lot of men did. A lot went and moved on for reasons I'll get into in a second. These men, the salaries would vary, but generally speaking, they were paid about $30 a month, of which $25 as a condition had to be sent back home to their families. That was not something they could go and they could hold on to or negotiate. That was a condition of their joining. Again, these are men who were totally unemployed. Chances are their families are probably not in great straits either. It was a pretty good deal. It's difficult to translate that money into modern terms, but the average wage right about that time was about, daily wage, was about 54 cents. That translates to about $13.50 today, maybe a little bit under. So the C.C.C. guys would be earning $1 a day, 30 a month. That's about $25 a day, and for a month that is $751. Again, that 25-cent home means they sent home, in 2025 money, $626. So they had just about, in the meantime, $115, $120 or so dollars in our current, metric. These men were taken and they were trained at Army camps. The first one actually was, or rather the first, Civilian Conservation Corps camp was actually here in Virginia, not terribly far away. It was in the Shenandoah National, well, at the time it was Shenandoah National Forest. They're working on building it into the Shenandoah National Park. The history of the Civilian Conservation Corps in Virginia in particular is tied very, very closely to Shenandoah National Forest. Again, in a process at that time becoming Shenandoah National Park, because a lot of the Civilian Conservation Corps programs on the East Coast ended up there at one time or another, particularly in the Mid-Atlantic. Why? That's for a number of reasons. Number one being that the Shenandoah program was a National Park Service program, therefore it was under the purview of the Department of the Interior, so it did not require state approval. So they could immediately, once the Conservation Corps had these fellows, they could immediately send them in to go and work at Shenandoah. Also, it was a massive program as well. That kind of helped, particularly building Skyline Drive, which is a very ambitious program for the national parks. The national parks, of course, had existed since the early 1900s. There was a Theodore Roosevelt, program. But of the parks that had been built, the vast majority of them were in the West, and again, they pretty much already been done. So to have a very large, very ambitious national park in proximity to the, generally speaking, the large cities of the East Coast was very advantageous. So a lot of these men went down to Camp NF1, National Forest 1, near a little bit north of where Luray is now. And Roosevelt himself went down there on occasion, particularly early on in the program, to go and supervise and see what was going on. And that's where Virginia State Parks comes in. The idea of state parks was not really the most novel idea on the planet, but still had not significantly caught on. A lot of states did not have a state parks program by this point. I'm talking about the 1920s, before the Depression. But once the stock market crash came along in 1929, it really threw everybody's plans and what they wanted to do as regards government functions into total disarray. But in the 1920s, there were, again, a few states with a state park program. California was one, Minnesota and New York, and other than that, it was not an enormous amount. It was an idea that had been proposed that all states should have a state park program. They even had a conference in 1921 in Des Moines, Iowa, to this effect, invited delegates from every state. Virginia did not attend that conference, but there were subsequent ones, and Virginia sent delegates. And it wasn't because of a lack of interest or the fact that Virginia felt that parks were something they couldn't afford to spend their time on. It was that the southern states, Virginia included, were strapped for cash, really, at the time. A condition that the Great Depression, arriving later in the decade, certainly exacerbated for them. But in the mid-1920s, the idea of Virginia having a state park system kind of caught traction in Richmond, and the General Assembly went and created a board, a Parks Development Board, headed by one William Carson, who's an enormously influential figure in the creation of Virginia State Parks. Now, the problem that Carson had, he was very passionate about this thing. He felt that Virginians should be able to have a state park system, that they should be able to take a weekend off, and say if they lived on the coast, on the Chesapeake, they should be able to have a destination to travel to in the mountains. They might not have that otherwise. Keep in mind, again, national parks didn't really exist in this part of the country at this point. They were primarily western things. People didn't really have destinations to travel to. And it was a way in particular that he felt for citizens of the Commonwealth to get to see and appreciate the natural beauty of the state they inhabited. But it was very, very difficult to go and to get men, material, funds, even before anything else. Like I said, Virginia and a lot of other southern states were cash-strapped all through the early part of the 20th century, and which the Great Depression made pretty much infinitely worse. And they had tried to establish a state park, a singular state park. It was a collection of Civil War battlefields around Richmond. They tried this in the latter years of the Hoover administration, 31, 32. And this had been really, ultimately it had come to nothing because they just couldn't get, they had the funds finally from the General Assembly, but who saw a lot of promise in this program, but they couldn't get the labor, essentially. So Carson and the Parks Development Committee very grudgingly and frankly with much frustration had to go and give up this sort of embryonic park they were working on. They wanted to give it to the National Park Service, thinking they could do something better. Today it's Richmond Battlefield National Park, which is a collection of parks all around Richmond. I don't know exactly how big it was when Virginia was developing it. It's very difficult to find that in the records. But chances are it's probably not much more than 3 or 4 sites. Today it's 13. But my point being is that it was very difficult to get anything going, and when they finally had got something going in regard to developing state parks, it's been yanked out from under their feet. So there's a lot of frustration. But when the Conservation Corps got going, Carson, still down in Richmond and still head of the Parks Development Program, saw an opportunity. He went and he visited Roosevelt one time when Roosevelt came on down to the Shenandoah, and he said, basically, look, I know you have this works program, Civilian Conservation Corps. I know you're taking young men out into the woods and working on doing, again, ecological programs like reseeding or planting trees, or particularly a duty that the Corps came to embrace was building dams. Here's the thing, is that I think I can persuade the General Assembly to go and fork over the money if you can supply the labor. Because if you supply the labor, that's free. We don't need to pay for it on our end. You have these men, you want to be able to do something with them. Essentially, this is a great bargain, And Roosevelt agreed that this was a fantastic idea. Virginia was, consequently, through Carson, was one of the first states to sort of come forward and say, well, this is a great program. We want to take it from a national level and bring it on down to a state level. That hadn't really been done before. Virginia was kind of an innovator in that regard. Tenacity and ingenuity, and the Roosevelt, Roosevelt personally, his willingness to work with Virginia. Virginia immediately received a good amount of, at least promised, companies. The men didn't immediately arrive, of course, but promised companies. So they got to working on drawing up a very ambitious state park system. Carson had, as his right-hand man for the State Parks Development Commission, a fellow by the name of Richard Burson. Burson's a very interesting figure. He was from Southwest Virginia, at least he resided there. But actually, he was an Englishman originally who moved to the United States. He was a gardener, really an expert on horticulture. So he understood how, generally speaking, parks should be structured. This is a much more 20th century mindset here, not as parks as a place of recreation or hiking, but really parks closer to, say, Central Park, a place for people to go and enjoy the natural beauty, if you will. So Burson was commissioned to go and travel around the state and go and find the best spots, in his opinion, to build a park, and to go and, as much as possible, go and design them. To that end, he had help. National Park Service stepped in. They actually did a lot of the labor going and drawing up their own suggestions what the parks should be structured based on National Park Service criteria. This actually was something that Virginia later on came to, once they realized that they could get this help, they came to insist upon that our parks be national park quality. But in regard to the money situation, the General Assembly gave the Parks Development Commission, once they learned of the upcoming labor, gave them $50,000, which today is about $1.25 million, with which to purchase 6 state park sites. So they wanted a park more or less in every quadrant of the state. They were able to secure right out the box not for money, but by donation, for sites, which is fantastic. So they still had $50,000 unspent, but they very much wanted a state park in this area. That was something that the State Parks Development Commission had desired really since day one, when they started drawing up sort of very much theoretical plans for how they wanted to structure their parks. They wanted one, and not just in the Tidewater, but they even say in the Northern Neck. And they wanted one particularly here in Westmoreland County because, well, for two and maybe one reason. Because of George Washington's birthplace in Stratford Hall, primarily. These were developing tourist sites at the time. George Washington's birthplace was being worked on and turned into a national monument by the Park Service. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Stratford Hall was just being renovated. At this time, it was purchased in the late 1920s by a group that was working to renovate it. So these were developing tourist sites, and they weren't terribly far from Washington, D.C., all things considered. So the Parks Commission very much wanted a park in this area, in addition as well to the natural beauty. And so they went out of their way to go, and they commissioned a man by the name of Fred Nash, and they purchased land from him for $15,000. Keep in mind, this is they spent nothing up until this point. So $15,000, they're perfectly happy to spend that money. It's about $375,000 today. They purchased a tract of land, which historically had been timbering land, located between Stratford Hall and George Washington's birthplace on the Potomac. They were extremely happy with that purchase. Again, this is the only spot in Virginia where they wanted, we need a park there. You know, they said very vaguely, we want one in the Southwest, we want one in the South Side, we want one in the Alleghenies, but this park they really very much wanted. So Westmoreland State Park, rather what will become Westmoreland State Park, was the fifth property they acquired. And then, as an aside, they were able to purchase, with that leftover money, another park, which became Stanton River State Park in southwest Virginia, Southside Virginia, almost to the North Carolina border. Westmoreland State Park, or rather, again, what will become Westmoreland State Park, was designated as Project SP-19, that's State Park 19. It was the 19th state park being worked on throughout the entire country. That was how that worked. So they brought a company, a C.C.C. company, in to work on it in, let me think, October or November, I believe October of 1933. That was company 287. They were primarily now some of the men were from the area. They were from the Northern Neck, but, and this is very interesting, particularly when we talk about the history of our park, a lot of the men who came, in fact the majority of them, were from outside the area. For a number of, that's for a number of reasons. Number one, keep in mind the requirement you had to be unemployed. Right? We had people here in the Northern Neck who were perhaps in poverty, but there weren't an enormous amount of people. Again, there were some, but not a lot who were totally unemployed. A lot of men impoverished, not unemployed, though. Therefore, they couldn't qualify. That was a source of some frustration, not only for young men in the area, but throughout the country. But the problem was so big, the economic problem was just so enormous across the country that it was a necessary requirement that the Roosevelt program, tacked on to enlist in the Civilian Conservation Corps. So where did the men come from who worked on Westmoreland State Park? At least the majority of them. They came from industrial cities of the North in particular, New Jersey and New York City area, and also Pennsylvania as well. So the area, Allentown, Newark, Greensburg, Pennsylvania, which is around Pittsburgh, basically, if you can imagine. There were very few exceptions. I believe there were some men who were not from here, who were not from those areas, but they were very much few and far between. These men, or rather here, for this program, again, not only because they were unemployed, but also because there were a lot of them. These were big cities, right? And they had a lot of people out of work because you have one factory go belly up, one steel producing facility go belly up. That's a lot of people, not just young men, out of work. So it not only was availability, it also was quantity. So a lot of these young men here, they really didn't know what they were getting into at first, when the first company arrived. But here's the thing, is that they didn't faze them too much. What was behind them was scarier than what was ahead. We have the accounts of one man, young man, he was 17 years old. I'm not sure about this. He may have told the recruiting staff he was 18. I feel like he probably would have had to, but I don't have direct confirmation of that. But his name was Tom Salinger, excuse me. He was from New Jersey, and he was sent out one day. He lived, I believe, in the area of Atlantic City, New Jersey. He was sent out one day by his mother to go to the bakery to go and to buy bread. So when he took his car out, and right next to the bakery, before he even stepped foot inside, was a C.C.C. Recruitment booth. Think very much like those old World War II movies where you're walking past on the street and it says, come inside, young men, join the Marines, join the Navy. Exactly the same thing, except, it said C.C.C. instead of Marines or Navy. Well, Salinger really didn't think twice, at least in his own account. He totally forgot, or rather, forgot about the bread, and he stepped right inside. He told a friend, I've just signed up for the Civilian Conservation Corps. I believe he called him on the phone. Can you drive my car back to my parents' house and tell them where I am, basically, that I'm going to be gone for at least 6 months. I think he probably did that because he didn't want his parents to be mad. He did recount later on his mother was incredibly mad at him. Really can't say I would blame her, honestly. Imagine sending your son out to pick up bread. He vanishes for 6 months. You don't even know where. But he ended up here. He arrived here, again, about October 1933 and joined up with Company 287. Salinger himself went to go train at Camp Dix for about 2 weeks in New Jersey. This was a military camp, a military facility where he learned things such as cleanliness and how to function in a camp, basically how the Corps was going to be structured, essentially, when he arrived. And when he came here to Westmoreland County, he joined up with the rest of Camp 287, who were arriving from training in Idaho, actually. So when you get the Army involved, they were able to move these men very, very quickly across the country. Keep in mind, this is 1933, but it was no big deal for them to go all the way out to Idaho for something like this. When they arrived at the land that had been purchased from Mr. Nash, they immediately began work on even just a road into the park. Again, this is timbering land, primarily. It had never been cultivated, at least not in any agricultural function, at least not in any significant way. They had to work on a road into the park. Had to build barracks, right? There were no buildings there. They were living in tents, at least initially. They wanted to make contract to a fellow from in the area. He came out and they helped him build it, essentially. He designed the barracks. If you ever see, again, photos of the barracks, it looks exactly like a military barracks. Because functionally, in a lot of ways it was. These men of Company 287 were like the rest of the civilian concentration corps across the country in that they had military officers immediately in charge of them. Those were captains, majors, lieutenants, etc. The control was not as strict as one might think in some ways, but in other ways it was quite strict. These men would go, they would wake in the morning, they would have the raising of the flag, basically, and they would go and they would take breakfast, and then they'd go and spend a good amount of time organizing their barracks every single morning, and it was inspected every single morning. Shoes had to be underneath the bed and out of the way. Each man had a little trunk, to put his own belongings in. That had to be organized, and all of his belongings had to be inside of it, with the exception of 2 or 3 shirts, that might be hanging up. The bed sheet had to be turned over, military style, and the sheet had to be measured exactly. I believe it was 8 inches from top to bottom. They had to confer exactly to those specifications. Then they would go out and they would work. I'll get into what projects they were doing at the park in particular in a second, but they would work just about 8 hours. Now 8 hours manual labor, really it can be difficult, but keep in mind this was, for a lot of these guys, including some of the fellows who worked at the park, they testified directly to this, they've been working 10, 12, 16-hour days for really about as long as they've been in the workforce, since they were, in middle school or in early high school. So 8 hours was fantastic. Again, keep in mind, a wage that, while the vast majority of it got sent home to their families, was basically double what the average person was making on the outside, if you will. So that part was just fine by a lot of men. They really had very few complaints about the workload. The Corps, again, being headed by an ex-union guy, made very sure not to overload these young men, to have too heavy of a workload. Because this, again, it was a partisan program. You want to make sure it looked good as well, but also you didn't want to exhaust these young men. They were going and were trying not to be on the streets. They were trying just to get a little bit of paycheck. So you really didn't want to overload them and have them essentially desert, if you will, which means it got to be a little more stringent, a little less stringent as the program continued. But generally speaking, it was military. You couldn't leave the program, at least not for the first 6 months. You could grumble, certainly. Later on, they might have made a few exceptions here and there. But generally speaking, they wanted their fellows to be happy, So the work was not terribly intensive. That being said, it was indeed, I think certainly by modern standards, it was hard labor. When they started building the park, they didn't have any machines of any kind. Later on, about 1934 or 35, they had a couple bulldozers, but other than that, it was entirely just picks and shovels. And after they built their barracks, they went and they built a building for the National Park Service, which no longer exists, but the National Park Service came on down from George Washington's birthplace to personally advise on this program. So they were headquartered there as well, directly across from where the barracks were. Then when they worked on building cabins, building maintenance areas for themselves, so they had a blacksmith shop, as well as just general storage, garages for the trucks. They did indeed have military trucks, which and buses, but those were, again, early on allowed only to be used by actual enlisted members of the Army. Generally speaking, the young men, they would go and they would retire at about 4 or 5 on a weekday. They would go and they would, I believe they would salute the flag right after. There are a few conflicting accounts, right after the workday, and it would be lowered, or it might be at the end of day. But I'll get into what happened at the end of the day. Regardless of when exactly that took place, the fact of the matter remains it did happen. Again, very much military style. They would go and they'd have dinner in the mess hall. We have some of the surviving menus. Actually, the food appears to be quite good. And that was certainly a plus for a lot of these young men. We have the testimony of one fellow who was from the area, a young man by the name of Jack Barrett. He was from Richmond County. Barrett was indeed unemployed and therefore eligible for enlistment in the Civilian Conservation Corps, but by his own account, he was not in the worst possible straits he could have been. Again, these are his own words, from an area where there was much cultivated fruits and vegetables. There were fruit trees. Pretty much everyone had a garden, so he wasn't hungry. Again, by his own account, a lot of the young men, when they arrived from the north, they were starving. I'm not using that in any kind of exaggeration. Barrett talks about how the first meal at the mess hall after they arrived, these young men went and fell on the food, and they'd eaten like they'd never seen food before. In his own words, they reminded him of a pack of ravenous dogs. It was just that bad at the time. So I'm sure the men of the Corps would have eaten whatever was put in front of them, but I'm sure it was a plus that the menus that we do have, at least, food sounds pretty good. And of course, it was breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They would, I neglected to mention, they would retire back. Sometimes they would take lunch in the field on their work site, but oftentimes as well, they would go and retire back to the mess hall. A little bit easier to control the movement of plates and knives and things like that way. Then if it was a weekday, the men, particularly early on, would go and would engage in perhaps educational programs. Some of them did self-education. Certainly, I mean, you could basically do whatever you want for a few hours in the evening once you washed your plate and cleaned up the bunkhouse yet again, swept it out twice a day. A lot of young men, not just here but throughout the entire country, did college by mail, college courses by mail, which was kind of in vogue at the time. They would engage in some literacy classes, which were offered there, as well as a few other skills. I'll get into that in a second. If it was a Friday evening, at least here at this camp Banesville, in Banesville, Virginia, they would go and they would have Friday entertainment that was oftentimes at the actual site on the camp. They would not go off-site for it, although on occasion that might differ. But it would be, they would have a little acting troupe. On the weekends, they might be bused to Colonial Beach, perhaps, for dances, or just to get to, visit some restaurants and things like that. I think they might have come down to Montrose a few times, and mostly they gravitated towards Colonial Beach. This was under the supervision of the Army officers in charge of the camp, who drove them out there. And every once in a while, they would drive up to Fredericksburg for a gala dance, conditions like Christmas or 4th of July or something like that might have caused some sort of big ceremony to be thrown. But generally speaking, they were either at the camp or in Colonial Beach or in Fredericksburg, and really there were very few exceptions other than that. On Sundays, as regards religion, the Catholic members, and there were a few because they were from, a lot of these fellows were from places like Allentown. They were from Newark, so a lot of them were Italian. They would go, at least early on, 3 Sundays out of the month, they would have a Catholic chaplain come out and offer services. The 4th Sunday, they'd be bused into town. A lot of Protestant churches did similar things, where they had a chaplain come out. That was not always consistent, but then a lot of the time too, the Army is more than happy to bus people, members of the camp, to Protestant services in the area. And then later on, some went, and if they simply knew people in the area, oh hey, can you swing by Sunday morning, grab me, we're going to go to church together, So that was really not an uncommon situation. Again, it was very strict in some ways, but very lax in other ways. This was a civilian program, and the Army had to kind of grow into it as much as the civilians had to grow into it. I can't emphasize it enough, like I said before, this was unprecedented. But I like to think the Army did a pretty good job kind of treading a middle ground. Certainly. Later on, the men, they'd be allowed a little more freedom. Even early on, some fellows who lived in the area, particularly in Bainesville, they would not live at the camp. They would go and they would simply walk back home every evening. I'm sure they could stick around and hang out with the fellows at the camp. Some went and took their own cars, and if they lived a little further, they would go and they would drive home. So it was almost like high school in some ways. But if you were from outside of the area, then you actually were stuck there simply because there's no place to go. I mean, where would you go? The Westmoreland State Park, like I said before, was designed with a lot of National Park Service input. There's a very interesting episode in the archival documents that I found where it goes through kind of the early iterations of the park before it arrived in its current form. And they had a plan early on to go and to have a 2-lane freeway running between Stratford Hall on one side to George Washington Birthplace on the other side. Now this sounds like a crazy idea now, particularly given the park that we know today. But it was actually quite congruent with the National Park Service and even conservation philosophy that existed at the time. Keep in mind, like I said before, Shenandoah was enormously influential in the designing and the growth of the Conservation Corps in Virginia. Skyline Drive was based on a philosophy that was very popular in national parks at the time. I think it's a very good philosophy, that of a smoothly curving road that, what's the word, conforms to the natural state of the area, essentially, that is not intrusive, that is something that does not disturb a visitor's experience of the area, if that makes sense. And that's exactly what they were trying to build at Skyline Drive. It was not the only place. Crater Lake in Oregon was something similar. The Rim Drive around Crater Lake was built on the exact same philosophy. So reading that, I can guess and speculate, and it is only speculation, that the freeway that they had planned, or at least were talking about for Westmoreland, was something very similar, a 2-lane, trying to be unobtrusive to the viewer, to the visitor, but allowing a easy connection between, again, George Washington Birthplace and Stratford Hall, which were big tourist sites. For whatever reason, it was never built. It just disappears from records. They stopped talking about it after a certain point. But it was a pretty big idea. Likely, they probably didn't build it because of the fact that the cliffs probably would not be stable enough to support even then a 2-lane freeway with traffic as they might have hoped would be going on it. I think they probably were right about that. But it was certainly a plan that they had invested some energy in. There's an account of when Governor Peary of Virginia came to visit the site, and this was a big site, and we'll get into that in a second. He and Carson went and walked personally the proposed route where the freeway would be going. So there was a lot of government interest, particularly state, but also national, in this program. Senator Norris of Virginia, who of course is from Northumberland County, so from the area, made sure to stop in and visit. The dignitaries from the Department of Agriculture make sure to stop in as well, including the Assistant Secretary of Agriculture. Keep in mind, the country is still in pretty dire straits, right? But they still could find the time to come on down from DC and stop in and see how the Conservation Corps was doing, sort of as a microcosm of the larger Corps program throughout the country. And 2 different governors visited Virginia while the program was ongoing. And they expressed very, very high hopes for the park. And indeed, when the park opened, it opened in June of 1936 to a good amount of fanfare. It and the other 5 state parks, again, keep in mind, Westmoreland was only one of 6. They all opened on the same day. And there was a good amount of fanfare involved. But it's clear that there was still work to be done. By this point, Company 287 they'd already kind of moved on. The conditions in the country, particularly in the Corps at the time, were undergoing a shift, particularly in 1936, but also in 1935. 1935, Roosevelt starts what they call the Second New Deal. He didn't call it that, but historians since have called it. And that program was focused much more on actual work training, particularly in regard to the public works programs that included the Civilian Conservation Corps, because the economic situation, while still not great, was no longer declining. And that in and of itself was a victory. At least it was not getting worse. They kind of stopped it. It might even be on a slight improvement. And so Company 287 left. I believe they went out back to Shenandoah. I believe there were a few other places as well, not only in Virginia, but also in Pennsylvania and in New Jersey, where a lot of them came from. The company, what was it again? 2253, sometimes I say 5223, it was company 2352, so you kind of messed up on it. But different philosophy, if I had to guess, if it was indeed reflective of the programs going on in the broader Conservation Corps. Again, they moved towards work training. That is a hallmark, a heritage of the Civilian Conservation Corps throughout the country, that they had programs of vocational training to go and to teach young men, essentially what we today would call a trade. That was something that was not at all present in the early Civilian Conservation Corps for a number of reasons, and, well, really 2 reasons. The reasons were the Department of the Army, and they were Robert Fechner. And this is one where the 2 at least were in agreement finally. Neither of them wanted vocational training to go on in the evenings after work was done, or even on the weekends, or maybe even weekdays, as was originally proposed. It was proposed men work 4 days a week as opposed to 5, and then, say, Friday, Monday, or some day in between, go and take a vocational class. Both the Army and Fechner said, we're not going to do that. We are trying to basically put money in young men's pockets. It would be wonderful if we were able to give them skills they could take away from here. But the situation is so dire that we need to immediately give them cash as quickly as possible. So that was not something that they were able to incorporate early on in the program. And again, it would have been labor intensive on the part of the administrators of the Corps. They would have had to find people who could consistently train these men. They'd have to have materials. Say, you're talking about blacksmithing. It takes up a lot of time, and it's not necessarily a lot of instruction that needs to go on, but it's also not a little either, But while that idea was kind of put on hold, at least in 1933, in 1935, particularly in 1936 and 37, that began to be incorporated very strongly throughout the Corps. There was a push for it from the Roosevelt administration, and both Fechner and the Army came around and they said, okay, well, we can do this. This is time. This is the right push for the economy. We've given these young men money. Now they're doing okay. So we can go and we can give them a good salary, and then also send them out with training they can use in the real world. It was tried throughout the country. Generally speaking, it was not an enormous amount of men who were involved in the vocational programs when taken overall. If you look at the entire history of the Conservation Corps, it was about 3 million men who went and passed through the ranks. Most of them had already passed through by 1936, 1937. There were a few men who came in afterward who benefited enormously from the vocational programs, who learned a trade, and in some cases, went and practiced that trade for the rest of their lives. I know, for instance, that we have the documentation from one man who was stationed at a camp, in later years, who was from Pennsylvania by the name of Ed Brannock. He went and he took classes in bookkeeping and in photography, I'm sure in more, but those are that's the documentation that we have at the very least. And so these were pretty kind of out there skills, right? Certainly, they were not just carpentry. It was skills that you could use really all across the board. So as the program kind of progressed, there was a little more lenient here in Westmoreland County. Camp 2352 had a newsletter that was not terribly uncommon for the Conservation Corps, but it was something that they at least was new in this area. Company 287 had not done that, but they called it the Stratford Sentinel because they were located in proximity to Stratford Hall, and it's a valuable way. They really published it the entire time they were at the park, from 36 up until 1940, when they left. And it's a valuable way to get a feel for how the men felt about the Corps and their lives there. And really, they appear to be putting a lot of effort into it. They appear to be quite happy. These issues are very full. They're at least 10 pages, every one of them. They're published about once a month. They made sure, the editors at the very least, on the first issue to put a notice at the front, notice to Conservation Corps personnel. The duty of publishing this newsletter in no way detracts from our duties building the park, essentially. So they had to make sure, of course, it was not, things were loosening up, but it wasn't totally free. You couldn't do exactly anything you wanted with your own time. They were still working. But it's interesting, you really get a feel for how the men felt about the area. There's, gossip columns in there, Again, it's very 1930s, talking about so-and-so. It's like, oh, well, I saw, Corpsman so-and-so, some guy that everyone would have known in the barracks. Oh, he forgot, I don't know, his toothbrush last night or something like that. Isn't that hysterical, There are humor pages, and a lot of the jokes are quite funny, and some of them are very 1930s in that, like, you read them and you have no idea what they were trying to communicate. So, well, where's the punchline? I'm sure it was uproarious at the time, don't get me wrong. But, and again, some of them still hold up quite well. In the gossip columns, they would very frequently talk about the Army officers who were still in charge of the Corps there. And it would be, on occasion, a little bit embarrassing. When we were out in Colonial Beach the other night, you saw Lieutenant so-and-so. He was talking to this girl. I think there might be something there. What do you guys think? Write us to let us know your opinions, And this, of course, an Army officer who's in charge of supervising. There certainly can be gleaned a good amount of camaraderie from the newsletter, as well as, again, from the men's personal letters. But the newsletter is a very good way of kind of getting a pulse on the feel of these men at the time. They would oftentimes go and include news in there, news about the country, and motivational stuff as well, saying, times are hard, but power through, essentially, would be the message of a lot of these things. For a lot of these young men, again, who were not from the area and never left home, the vast majority of them, at least again early on, they had quite a culture shock in coming here, and that's reflected in the newsletter. You have one, I suppose it was under the humor section, one joke in there about, here we are next to George Washington's birthplace, the birthplace of the father of our country. Now I know why they say Washington never told a lie, because he had no one to tell it to. A testament to the rural character of the Northern Neck. These guys are from Allentown, they were from Pittsburgh, they were from Newark. These are big cities. They've never been in an area like this. Even their personal letters, they talk about how it was weird. It was weird not to have people around. Frankly, some of them went and tried to adjust to local culture. We have the letters, or the, rather, not the letters, the personal recollection of one man who was he was a part of a camp 351, which I mentioned early on. They weren't at the park, but they worked on the park, particularly in the later years of the 1930s. They were at George Washington's birthplace, and that was their primary responsibility. But we have the recollections of one man, William Weand, I believe is how it's pronounced. He's from the Pittsburgh area. He talked about his first time having steamed crabs in Colonial Beach, which he referred to as boiled crabs. So, he was from Pennsylvania, right? And the terminology, he said that certainly there was a weird experience, that he enjoyed it, but it was very strange, to eat these basically spiders. He doesn't directly say that, but I get that's the feeling that he's talking about. So moving on from the latter years for Company 2352, again, there was, when they inherited, so to speak, the responsibility of working at the state park, there was still a lot of labor to be done. They constructed a few more cabins. They built what then was the restaurant, which today is a Murphy Hall, which is a rental venue. They constructed the visitor center. The beach had already, not Fossil Beach, but the main beach and all the areas down there had already been constructed by the first company, Company 287. But 2352 kind of filled in the gaps, so to speak. And then also, as time went on, these men kind of branched out to do projects out in the area in Westmoreland County, some even as far away as, Fredericksburg in one direction, or Tappahannock to the other. I'm not exactly sure what they did, and someone here might know more than I on that subject, but they do mention there were other programs in addition to the state park. Similar again to 351. Thank you. Yeah. Similar again to 351, who was at George Washington's birthplace and doing programs all throughout the area. But by 1939, the program was radically changing. Robert Fechner died. He died literally at his desk, perhaps with his boots on as well. And so the character of the program began to change, not only because of his death, but also because of the changing situation, economic situation in the country. So it was a national situation. There was war on the horizon. Pearl Harbor was only a few years off at this point. People couldn't have anticipated it. But, rumblings of war in Europe meant that the Roosevelt administration wanted to shift their energies elsewhere, given that the economic crisis was not so dire in the country. So in 1939 and 40, they shifted radically toward work training. In fact, a lot of the C.C.C. labor throughout the entire country became, vocational training for young men to go back in the workforce and basically build up America's armament supply and to prepare America for potential war. In 1941 and 1942, obviously the U.S. is in the war, certainly in the latter year after December 1941. Enrollment for the Civilian Conservation Corps unsurprisingly dropped off, cataclysmically. These young men were, first of all, they were not in as worse straits as they were a decade prior. They were enlisting in the Army instead. They were enlisting in the Navy, things like that. So the Conservation Corps was inaugurated on a 10-year program that was 33 to 43. In 1942, Congress voted early, let's just cut this thing now. 9 years in, it's done the best we can get out of it, and we need to shift totally towards the war effort, which makes absolute sense. But the effect that the Corps had on the country is still felt today. It was manifold in the time. It was an effect that the work ethic had on the individuals involved in the Corps. I mean, you read the testimonies of young men who were talking about, as Roosevelt said, they were destitute, they were idle. He did not say that without some justification. A lot of young men say, well, I served only 6 months in the Corps, but it really, that work ethic that I got there when it turned my life around. I'm 60 years old, 70 years old. I've carried that work ethic that was inculcated and instilled in me throughout my entire life. That's a pretty common sentiment to find not only in greater C.C.C. historiography, but also the records of the men here at the park. We have letters that fellows wrote years later saying, oh hey, I heard, I've never met you, but I saw your name and I saw you were at Camp Bainesville building Westmoreland State Park. I was there too. You and I weren't there at the same time, but I want to hear your recollections. I want to hear what experiences you have to have. Maybe you'd like to hear some of mine sometime. So this was almost 50 years after actually now I think about it, over 50 years after, these men were here at the camp, but it had an enormous effect on them. A lot of young men, by no means the majority, but a lot of young men went and they stayed in the area, or they left and they came back, after the war. They went and said they were in the Navy, they came on down to Dahlgren and then lived out the rest of their lives here. That's fairly common to encounter. You almost think they wanted to end up at Dahlgren so as to be back in the area again. But that was quite clearly these young men's lives were changed. Those are their own words pretty frequently by this experience. They went and they saw a whole different part of the country. It was a whole adventure for them. It saved them from, again, destitution and who knows what. In some cases, perhaps starvation or a life of crime. It went and it told the country that basically we can do civilian programs like this. On a mass scale. We can have conservation programs like this on a mass scale, although, again, it was not the primary purpose, it was a secondary purpose of the C.C.C, to go out and replant trees and to build areas for people to enjoy and for nature to be preserved. It was certainly a sentiment and an effect that remained in public consciousness. That, we can do things like this. Again, it was unprecedented. Something like this had never happened before. So, similar programs have been tried in recent years. Virginia State Parks has a similar program for youth even today. California, I think for years on end, they've had a California Conservation Corps. I think they like that they can reuse the same acronym, C.C.C. Maybe they use some of the old material. I don't know. But it was and is a legacy that remains with the country today. There's an enormous amount of civilian conservation corps projects around the country, not only Westmoreland State Park, but just small ones even throughout the nation that are otherwise unnoticed. These men from out of the area came and visited this small part of the country, and they left a legacy here, both on the people of the Northern Neck, a legacy for themselves, and then a legacy for people to enjoy for years to come and years from now in Westmoreland State Park. So I think that's all I got to say on the subject. So I hope I didn't bore you all too much. It wasn't too scattershot or anything like that. But if you all have any questions or even commentary, I'd be happy to take it.
Well, I can't thank you all enough. Thank you so much from all of you, because I think each of you provided some information. Very helpful. Thank you.
That was good. Learned a lot.
Y'all have a great